prominent Newcastle buildings in the 1800s by Keating. Due to its establishment as a penal colony, the first prominent building in Newcastle was the jail. It was built near Parnell Place and overlooked the ocean. Other government buildings such as the courthouse and later the post office, telegraph office and customs house were community landmarks. With the growth of the coal industry, investment in the city surged and a number of substantial buildings were constructed. Keating takes us on a pictorial tour of some of those buildings that we can see today. Keating worked for over 40 years in local university, TAFE and secondary school libraries. Since her retirement, Julie has had two interests, research and local history, and has recorded information on Newcastle's early history from penal settlement to coal exporter. She has published several books on Newcastle and its suburbs, leads guided walks, and is a regular speaker at various groups such as U3A and the Newcastle Family History Society.
I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the people, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. What you've really come here today is to hear Julie with her wonderful talk about the prominent Newcastle buildings of the 1800s. Julie is a wonderful supporter of Newcastle Family History Society. She's been a member for a very long time. She's been on the management committee and she is always ready and willing to support us with anything we ask. So I'm not going to say anything too much about the topic because you're going to cover that. So could we all just welcome Julie, please?
So basically this is my idea, obviously, of what was a prominent building in Newcastle in the 1800s. And I'm very interested if at the end of it you've got suggestions as to what I've missed. But basically I'm concentrating on the inner city area of Newcastle. And I do apologise, you would have seen some of these slides before when I've done sessions on architects and things like that. But I hope that, you still find the concept interesting. So the first European settlement was attempted in 1801, but basically it didn't last very long. It was only a few months' duration. And the second attempt was made in 1804. Now, the first lot of people that came in at the second attempt included a support staff of 16 and 34 convicts. Yep. All right. Now, buildings were simple single-storey structures. At that time, there was no jail because basically you had to come to Newcastle by sea. Now, the jetty was supervised by military, so there was no way in the world you could just get on a ship and sort of go back to Sydney. The other thing was that if you escaped into the bush, you wouldn't know what your fate would be due to the Aboriginal people and, unfortunately, the way we treated them and they treated us. So basically convicts stayed put. So the early structure of Newcastle was like this. This is 1811 and Richard Brown, oh God, I left off an E at the title, sorry. He was a convict artist who was in prison. Now, the settlement probably wouldn't have been as ordered as that, but this is a depiction of what it was like. And the main features there, you can see that Nobbies was an island, so not connected to the headland. And the other thing on the left-hand side, the bottom, is where the jetty was. And that was located there at the end of Watt Street because convicts mined coal at the top of Church Street, carried the coal down, pushed down wheelbarrows, carts, whatever, and had to load it in the ships at the bottom of Watt Street. So that's why that sort of developed like that. So the buildings were simple. They were just single-storey structures using trees, and they made the walls of slabs, and basically they could just split the trees. I don't know, but you find the grain or something like that and you just whack it and the thing splits. So, there was no need for saw pits or anything like that. So they were able to make these structures. Now, up until 1816, no substantial buildings had been erected. It was just a case of these simple huts where people lived. Now, things changed under the commander, Captain Wallace, more substantial buildings were constructed, and one of the first was a new brick and stone church. Now, they did have a slab hut, and prisoners were directed they had to go to church on a Sunday. Now, a prominent feature of this church was the steeple. Unfortunately, it didn't last long because it had to be taken down. It was unstable. And this building was in use until 1884. Now, also built were a jail, hospital, stores and barracks, and absolutely none of those remain today. So this is the church. So very simple structure. Now imagine that sitting top where the cathedral is today, very exposed to the winds, and basically that steeple just had to come down. So that was removed, but that was the church structure that was used until the 1880s. So for over 60 years, that's where people worshipped. On the right is a depiction of the jail. That's done by Charles Martin. And we're talking about Parnell Place. Up the top of town, that's where the jail was. And it was a two-storey structure, quite a substantial structure. By this time, there were a significant number of convicts in Newcastle, and you can just get an idea of the size of the structure, how important that was to the community. Now, in the late 20s, 30s and 40s, substantial buildings started to appear. And this was mainly because things changed. Newcastle was no longer a convict settlement. The convicts were moved to Port Macquarie because too many of them were escaping back to Sydney. So we had this sort of mini building boom. And basically the structures were based on Georgian principles of symmetry, a central hallway with a room on either side and a veranda at the front. And those buildings didn't require trained architects. So basically, they just knew how to build them. It was basically a box. And also there was a limited range of materials and finishes, but that simplified the process. Now, one of the substantial structures was the courthouse. Now you can see the Georgian sort of symmetry of the front. Now this was 1840. This is the corner of Hunter and Bolton Streets, and that is where the post office later went. That in 1840 was the most substantial building in Newcastle. That was a big deal. Now, because it was courthouse, it was only used Monday to Friday during the day. And so the building was used for other purposes. On the weekends, church services were held there. And at night, there were things like concerts and meetings and performances and that sort of stuff. So, you know, it had a multiplicity of uses. And if you see these people sort of standing on the roof, they are starting to demolish the structure. So the only piece of that building that remains today is part of two of the columns. They were in Parnell Place. There was a display there. Part of the pillars were preserved in a monument up in Parnell Place. That was eventually removed, and apparently the remains are still in the museum. So there was an attempt to sort of get those remains removed and put in the new courthouse, but that came to nothing. So basically that's all that remains from that building. But you can imagine in the 1840s just what a substantial building that was. Now, another early place, once again, on Georgian lines. Do people recognise this place? Yeah. This is Claremont. So Claremont basically today is part of the Newcastle Businessmen's Club. All right. So it's the oldest intact Victorian Georgian home in Newcastle. And it was built for William Croadsteel, and he was employed by the AA Company. So you can imagine in the 1840s, the AA Company had the monopoly to mine coal. So that was a very, very substantial residence. So you can see the Businessmen's Club on the right, and this is New Common Street in the front. So that's an interesting building. If you're not familiar with it, to have a look at it. So we're fortunate that still stands. And another building built in the 1840s was the military barracks. Now, these were built for the soldiers who were employed basically as security for the settlement. But a few years after these were built, there was a change in the arrangement for security. And basically, England was no longer responsible, and it was taken over by the government. And that meant these premises were superfluous to government use. So then they were used for various purposes. And since 1871, they've been used for mental health facilities. And fortunately, these buildings still stand. So this would be one of, perhaps about half a dozen buildings that still stand from the 1840s time frame. And the substantial place that you see in the background there is Jessamine House. And to the left is the former Harbour Master's home, David Allen. He was the Harbour Master for a few decades, and the current dredge is named the David Allen after him. All right, so this is Toll Cottage, and this is at the rear of the Family Law Court. If you're not familiar with it, basically you just go to the rear of the Family Law Courts and you just look over their veranda and you see it there. Last time I was there, it looked as though it was used for storage purposes. I don't know if anyone's got an update or whether that's still its use. Yeah, so that was built in 1857, and it's also known as Rose Cottage. Toll Cottage was the name of a former owner, so you see it sort of referred to by various names. Now, things changed once the AA monopoly ended. Then you had new companies coming in to mine coal, and so that meant a bit of a building boom. So most of the early buildings were demolished, and there was also increased agitation for some form of council, because if we don't have councils, we don't maintain roads and provide services and things like that. So the population was increasing in the community. There had to be some form of local government, and the first attempt was the Newcastle Borough Council. That was in 1843, and then it was replaced by the Municipal Council in 1859. Now, the Borough Council, they met in a convict-built structure, and that was the Commissariat Department, and that was at the rear of 55 Watt Street. Now, new premises were built at the front, and council met there until the civic precinct opened in 1929. So how many people realise that was the former council building? That still stands in Watt Street. Very substantial building. It now houses the United Service Club, which was formed in 1927. So obviously next year they celebrate 100 years of that building. So it's sort of like going back in time when you go back into that building. It's sort of the old-fashioned sort of furnishings and things like that remain, but it's very interesting. So that was our first city council. Now, you would have seen many pictures of these. These were very prominent government buildings, and that was at the top of Watt Street. Sorry, Hunter Street. Now, the first block in Hunter Street, starting from Watt Street down to Bolton Street, was the prestigious address in Newcastle. So we had these prominent government buildings on one side, and on the other side we had substantial bank buildings. So that was the sort of block in Newcastle. So just take note, the police station here, and then we've got the Telegraph office and then the post office. Now, the post office on the right, that veranda is no longer there. And they have built a sort of portico in front of the former Telegraph office and post office. So it looks as though it's one building, but it's not. It's two buildings. And just sort of note, Hunter Street was a dirt road. But that they are substantial government buildings, and we're fortunate that they still stand today. And on the other side of the road was the sort of the bank buildings. So banks realised that that was the prestigious part of town. So they built substantial sort of two-storey premises. And you can see on the right-hand side, this photo was taken in 1905. So you see the roof of the post office. So that opened in 1901. So that was the status, high status. Now, this is the Trades Hall Building and Technical School of Mines. These were open in 1890s, and actually these buildings look very good at the moment because a few years ago they actually sandblasted them and cleaned them, and really it's worthwhile having a look at them if you haven't sort of done so recently. And on the right-hand side, on the top floor was where Newcastle's first museum was. So back in 1890s, there was a museum there. And of course, the Trades Hall moved from this building and went to the corner of King and Union Streets. And of course, that's now occupied by TAFE. And you can see on the left-hand side a little sort of extension which joins the current buildings to the old ones. So when you look at those buildings, they are very substantial and wonderfully they still stand. Now looking down Hunter Street, the Australian Joint Stock Bank is on the right. So that's obviously why it was named Bank Corner. That building is not there today. That was demolished to make way for the building that is there, which is an Art Deco structure. So in the 1930s, that was demolished. And the other building to take note of, you're not going to see it for much longer, is the former Spotlight building. So that's the one on the right with the sort of tower. And I've just had a mental block. It used to be Marcus Clark's, that's right, and Walton, yes. But since Spotlight moved out of it and permission has been granted, there will be a residential tower on that block. So that's why we have Bank Corner, because of the existence of that bank. Now, obviously, the hospital was an important structure. Now, the first hospital wasn't built until 1817, and it was a very basic structure. And if you read accounts of that in the early days, basically, there were very few facilities in that hospital, often prisoners who were patients had to sleep on the floor. They were given hay in winter to keep them warm. So really it was very, very basic. And it wasn't until 1866 that a new hospital was built. So that's a very substantial building. Now, the centre part and the part on the right were the first to be built, and then there was an extension. Now, extensions continued in the late 1880s. And one of the prime movers for this were the Hannell brothers. James Hannell was our first Lord Mayor, and Clarence Hannell was the harbour master, and they were very active in fundraising. So that's why we had the Hannell wing. And of course now it's Hannell residential units, but that's basically at the top of town. And yeah, the earthquake sort of finished that off. But the other sort of thing was with this building was it was a strategic risk. You don't have a hospital like that so open to enemy fire. Basically in the 1920s, they started to realise that they needed to move the hospital facilities. So the first step in that was they purchased the former Langton Lodge, which was Thomas Crowdis's house, and they used that as a convalescent hospital. But then in the Second World War, the government directed them to move the hospital, and so they erected what was known as the Chest Hospital that faces Lookout Road. That was erected in a matter of 6 weeks, and the government said they had to sort of move patients to that facility. And that was basically because of the risk to attack. And of course, once the earthquake made some of the buildings unstable, they moved the whole thing. But it was basically the vision of, I think his name was George Rankin, that the John Hunter complex was developed. So, but having it in that location, it was also an advantage because it was felt that the sea air was very healing for people. It was very good as regards sort of ventilation and things like that, but a risk. So this is the borough markets, and basically we have Market Street because of the location up there of these markets. Now that's a very unusual design as regards the ornamental wheel window and the turrets. And if you look up turret on the left-hand side, the first floor, that's where Ralph Snowball had his office. So it was basically market facilities on the ground floor, and then upstairs there were offices. And the reason they did that was basically to earn an income. So that was where the Strand Theatre was built after that building was demolished, and that was done in 1915. Now, the railway station in Newcastle, that was actually 5 pavilions. So if you look at it, there's a building on the left. Then there is another building. Now, the first floor is an infill between the second, third and fourth buildings. So that was not there when the railway station was originally built. And then you can see the pavilion, which is the 5th structure. So if you look at that building now, that infill on the second floor is not original. And that was considered a major example of Victorian railway architecture. And that was designed and built in 1878. Now, fortunately, that still stands and they've done a great renovation job on it. So that's a plus as regards our historical preservation. And this is Newcastle Public School. And it is Newcastle's oldest school, but it hasn't always been on that site. So Newcastle Public School first opened in 1816. This was built in the 1870s and it still stands today. And it's basically opposite the reservoir, the corner of Tyrrell and Brown. So once again, a substantial public building. And of course, this is the Customs House. Now, according to Architecture Newcastle, it is an outstanding work of architecture and is of great significance to the history of Newcastle. Now, obviously, we had a customs department before this period. Customs were important as regards revenue raising, and that in 1876 was a great improvement on what was there before. And if you ever come across the term the Queen's Warehouse, that was in Customs House. All right. Now, Fort Scratchley, basically there was a Russian threat to the English colonies. So there was a need to provide some sort of security. So this was built. Now, Peter Scratchley was the main engineer of this development. That's why it's called Fort Scratchley. And if you look on the left at the top, that's the dressing sheds, etc., for Nobby's Beach. So you can get some idea of how that is located. And of course, that was used in World War II. It was the only place where guns were fired from the Australian mainland. Sorry? Oh, sorry, yeah. Yeah. So, now this is basically opposite the railway station. For the people coming to the city, there was a need for accommodation. So there were two substantial hotels. So we're talking the corner of Scott and Watt Streets. So the station is sort of over on that side in front of the George Hotel. Obviously, this is not the Great Northern Hotel that is there today. So this is another sort of example. We had the bank corner where the original bank was demolished to make another one. This is another example of that sort of thing. This was the original, sorry, no, it's not the original. There was a weatherboard thing on this side, and then this more substantial hotel was built. That was demolished, and the current Great Northern Hotel is, of course, Art Deco design, so that was built in the 1930s. So at the moment, the bottom level of that has been refurbished. There's a problem as regards the other floors. It's very difficult to provide services that people expect today. So there are bedrooms on the upper floors in the Great Northern, but they don't have ensuite bathrooms. So it's a case of they have to sort of provide ensuite bathrooms. So they'll probably have every second room divided off into two so that it provides an ensuite for one side and an ensuite for the other side. But unfortunately, the developer who's got that at the moment is not making much progress. So a bit of a problem with that. All right, now this is a house in Church Street. This was built in the 1870s and it was built for the police magistrate. Now, in this time frame, the police magistrate was a very important person in the community, very substantial property. Now, this is in Church Street, as I said, and to the right is woodland. So it's sort of the bottom end of Church Street. So it's obviously a fairly well maintained property, fortunately. And yeah, it's nice to see something like that still standing. Now, along that street in Church Street were substantial residences with extensive gardens. Now, up this end of Church Street, you'll see there are a number of unit buildings. And a number of those buildings retain the name of the original property. So some of the old houses still remain, but obviously some have been demolished. And they would have extensive views over the harbour and ocean. Now, this is the Victoria Theatre. And today it's the oldest purpose-built theatre in New South Wales, and it's currently being renovated. Now, the big thing about this is that the owners kept it watertight, so they maintained the roof. So the renovation cost for this is not as substantial as, say, for the post office. Post office, they did not maintain the roof, which led to a lot of the structural issues, and so increased the renovation bill. But this, fortunately, was always watertight. And in 2015, they got a $4 million grant, and still hasn't opened, so hopefully they're still working on it. Now, this project, basically by Henry Buchanan. Now, he was a mayor in Newcastle at this point in time, and the description by Architecture in Newcastle is that this group of buildings undoubtedly makes a significant streetscape contribution to an area rich in history and fine architecture. So we're talking Watt, Church and Bolton Streets. All right. So Buchanan purchased the property of nearly an acre and he built 18 terraces of 4 floors facing Church Street and 3 floors facing Watt. And at each corner were larger structures. Now, this is the complex that we're talking about. So on the left is an 1891 view. Now, on the right-hand side, fortunately, the veranda has been reinstated. With these buildings, once you remove the veranda, it really looks, you know, much less impressive. And I'm really surprised that they were able to get that veranda reinstated. I think it does wonders for the building. So fortunately, we have that. So these terraces fronting Church Street were 4 stories with the kitchen at the basement level, which was how things were done in that time. And then these are the ones that go down Watt Street, and they're 3 stories. You can just see to the left of that terrace house there that there's an entryway and there were stable facilities out the back. And of course, the problem for these people nowadays in these places, they've all got cars and things like that. And so that makes it a bit difficult. But, you know, very substantial project that was. Now, this is an example of a building that needs a bit of TLC, I suppose you could say. So this is the municipal building in Hunter Street in 1887, all right? On the right is what it is today. So once you remove the veranda, not nearly as imposing. So this is Market Street going down here. And of course, this area is a bit sort of sad at the moment because they're undertaking that major building project opposite. But it'd be wonderful to see that painted. You know, it's just so sad. But yeah, probably was. Very good. Yes, yes. And I mean, it just looks gorgeous, doesn't it? And the next photo was sort of the same sort of thing. Outstanding building. And the right-hand side, you see what it is today. I mean, that is so ugly. You know, every time you go, oh, I go past there, I just think, it was, you know, this was just so impressive. See, there's a water fountain out the front. I mean, it really was high-class sort of building as regards retail. It would have had substantial windows in the front, and then inside would have been mirrors and stuff like that. And, of course, all the ornamentation on the top, a lot of that has been removed. You know, it's just sad to see what some of these buildings have become. But suppose that's progress, isn't it? Now, this building, even though it is theoretically in Wickham, it is still part of the Honeysuckle estate. And this was opened in December 1882. Now, the Hunter Development Corporation owned this land, and their fervent desire was to demolish that building because basically they wanted to offer for sale a vacant block of land. But this building was so important to the Wickham community that fortunately attempts for it to be demolished were, well, the National Trust got very involved in it. Basically, that building was, I suppose, most famous because Henry Lawson went there. It also was the venue for the first Star Society in Newcastle, which was the forerunner to the Newcastle Permanent Building Society. It had the first free kindergarten in the area, was located there. And at the back there was a hall where people who had subsidence issues could come and get advice. So that was the forerunner to the Mine Subsidence Board. So, I mean, it had important community links. And when, you know, you consider the Newcastle Permanent Building Society, it's still going after all this time. So that's a huge sort of historical fact. And so today it basically sits by itself. It has been painted. Whoever buys that land is expected to incorporate that into future use, which they could easily do. It's been done elsewhere. So we'll just sort of have to see what happens as regards who purchases that and what they actually decide to build on that site. This is sort of one of my favourite buildings. It was a Northumberland Building Society. And this is on the corner of Hunter and Burwood Streets. Now, once again, it was decided to demolish this building, and basically they wanted more rental space. So they were trying to cut costs, and they had another building built, which basically had retail on the ground floor. So that meant that they got an income from that rather than occupying the whole building. But if this building was still standing according to Norm Barney, it was a gem of a building and it would attract national and international attention, you know. And basically today, this is the site of the law courts. So we're talking Hunter and Burwood Streets. Yep.
Was the building actually very narrow, or was it?
It's a wedge shape.
That's what I thought.
It's a wedge shape.
Yeah.
So
There's buildings like that in several cities around the world. They're impressive, very impressive.
I mean,
Pity we've lost it.
you know, I mean, the design elements and, you know, it was just so substantial and so unusual, and the workmanship that has gone into that, to think that we just demolished these buildings, and it's very sad. Now, how many people have looked at that and appreciated the architecture of that? I mean, that, yes, a whimsical building, its decoration being unfettered by rigid style rules. Windows and doors are of varying shapes and sizes. So if you stand there and look at it, you know, I sort of didn't realise that fact until I read this thing in Architecture Newcastle. But look at it. All the windows and doors are different. So basically, these were offices for solicitors working at the courthouse. So up the end of this part of Brown Street was the courthouse. Now, obviously, that's not the case today, but solicitors had their offices here, and on the right-hand side, you can see the part of the structure that was devoted to a number of residences. So today, it's sort of a mixture of residential, and there are some offices remaining, but just, you know, looking at the design that's gone into that, you know, it's a beautiful building. And yes, the paintwork sort of, you know, really makes it attractive. And if you just look on the right-hand side, you see the building next to it, a multi-storey brick building. And of course, that is Cohen's Warehouse. So fortunately, they repurposed that. So it's now a parking station. And according to Architecture Newcastle, it's a monochromatic dark red facade and brickwork masterpiece. And the National Trust said it's one of the best examples of Federation area warehouse in Australia. So we're fortunate that that still stands as well. Now, the cathedral is a very prominent building in Newcastle. And the new cathedral was designed by John Horbury Hunt. Now, if you read accounts of Hunt, he basically didn't get on with the Dean of the Cathedral, Arthur Selwyn. So, I mean, they're sort of backwards and forwards sort of bickering was a major issue. But basically, Horbury Hunt, he designed this building. It stated that he was one of the most important ecclesiastical architects in the country. That's from Barry Maitland. But the Dean of the Cathedral had his own ideas. So the two personalities clashed. So even though the competition was held in the 1860s, plans were presented in 1883. And because it was taking so long and they had to wait until the old church was demolished, which was the one I indicated earlier on, they had to erect a pro-cathedral on the opposite side. So today, if you go in Church Street, the building opposite the cathedral, the two-storey one, is a hall, and that was the temporary pro-cathedral. Now, it's a very substantial building and the interior was designed by Menkins, and today it is part of the grammar school. Now, it wasn't until 1892 the foundation stone was laid and then construction commenced, but it stopped. Then Castleton took over as architect, and basically the building was dedicated in 1902, chancel completed in 1912, the nave 1928, and the tower in 1979. So, I mean, if you're interested in, you know, a frustrating story, that's certainly the cathedral, you know. And today they seem to be doing major renovations. There seems to be scaffolding and other sorts of things there at the moment. But the cathedral is obviously one of our most prominent buildings. And that is Horbury Hunt's original drawing of the cathedral. So, very impressive. Now, of course, any thing on architecture in Newcastle, we can't neglect to mention Frederick Menkins. And I covered a lot of this in the previous talk about him. And according to Redmond, which is the Bible on architecture in the Hunter in this early period, he is the most significant of the architects working in Newcastle for the 20 years from the 1880s. And he was the only early architect to have had full-time architectural training. He studied in his hometown in Germany, and so he had formal training, which of course you can imagine in New South Wales, there wasn't formal training for architects. So as regards Menkins, that's a picture of him on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, Brian Suter said that this is possibly Menkins' masterpiece. It's ornamental and fanciful Baroque facade reflecting architectural styles of his birthplace. So, I mean, that is just a stunning building, still stands in Scott Street. For a time, it was the Longworth Institute. It was bought by the Longworth family. Then it was the Air Force Club, and now it's a private residence. It's been bought by an artist. I don't know if he's a painter or a sculptor. So it still stands, fortunately. And I'm assuming everyone knows where that building is. Yeah. All right. Now, just look on the left-hand side of that building. We have what is called the Centennial Hotel. Right, now this was built in 1888 and it was the hotel of the time. So besides the lavish furnishings, they had mirrors, marble tops, fittings of carved timber, and they had flushing water closets. So that was really big deal. And a fire plug. 50 feet of, oh
Hose.
God, hose in the bathroom, she was woeful getting old, honestly. Ready for use at a moment's notice. So that basically would have been taken down to the harbour, water pumped. There was a problem with fire because a lot of the structures were weatherboard and there were no firewalls. So once the fire started, it would just go through. And Newcastle was actually known as the City of Blazes at one stage. So having a fire hose was a big deal as well. And of course, they provided heating and hot and cold water. So, I mean, they were really the latest features. This is the Centennial Hotel. So basically this is the Menkins designed building. The Centennial Hotel as it faces Scott Street. And in our wonderful streetscape of Hunter Street, this is the other side. See where the graffiti is on that board? You can just see above. It's the same sort of triple window sort of thing. So that is the only building that basically goes from Hunter Street to Scott Street. So now it's residential apartments in that. Hopefully we'll see an improvement as regards that sort of area. But it's just interesting if you sort of are in Hunter Street to look up and there is a nameplate above that that indicates it was the Centennial. And of course, this is the Castlemaine Brewery. Now the brewery was a franchise of the Castlemaine Brewery in Victoria, and it was operated by the Wood brothers. Basically, one of those had Jesmond House and the other had Woodlands, and it was later used for the Regional Museum, and it's now residential. And it's also, if you remember, the Pink Elephant Market. So substantial building, and see where the tower is at that time. That was the highest building in Newcastle West. All right, now this is Jesmond House that I pointed out earlier when looking at the James Fletcher Hospital. And as I mentioned, one of the Woods had the Castlemaine Brewery. Now, this structure at the back here was the servants' quarters. They were designed by Menkins. And another interesting fact is, see the building across the road from Jesmond House, the two-storey building? That was originally a single story, and that was the coach house.
On this house.
Yes.
The street might not have been there.
Well, no, actually the street was there. But yes, they would have had to.
So the carriage would be brought to the door.
Of course it would have.
Oh, just penthouse.
Yes,
yes.
yes. So I mean, you know, at last sold, if I can find out, 2012 for $7 million, but if it was on the market today, I imagine it would be close to the 20 million mark. So, yeah, fascinating place.
Is it apartments now, Julie?
Oh, no, single family owner. Yes, what's his name? Matthew Higgins, I think it is. And he used to be in business with Nathan Tinkler.
Oh,
And his business is at Raymond Terrace, there's a race.
yes,
A racetrack.
yes.
Sorry?
Yeah, before you get to Moray Farm.
It's
yes.
more Italia Road.
Further north.
On further north.
Yes.
Oh.
He has a sort of racetrack for boys and their toys. And
Oh, yeah.
I don't know what it's called.
Didn't Italian something? No, I know what you mean, but
Yeah. So that's his business
Yeah.
venture. All right. So
house here is.
this is the Baptist Tabernacle next to the Cultural Centre in Newcastle. It's been described as the finest type of Corinthian architecture in Australia, and very impressive. And opposite is St Andrews, which is the outstanding St Andrews Church, remains to this day probably the finest building in Newcastle. That's according to Brian Souters, who was a local architect. And architect in Newcastle says the yellow brickwork church with sandstone ornamentation and spire is the finest ecclesiastical work of Mencken's. So that's opposite the tabernacle, and that's another view of it.
Well, that was good to know.
So you can see the Baptist Tabernacle. There's Dawson Street going down the side of the tabernacle. This is Layman Street. And St Andrews originally had a manse, but that is no longer there. And of course, Auckland Street on the right is the structure built by the Salvation Army for homeless men, and now it's part of the conservatorium. And of course, the other important historical feature is the house here. That was the crossing keeper's house, because two railway lines intersected, and he had to go out there and sort of close the gate for one and open it for the other. So that house still stands. So
It's sort of weed shop too.
Yes. So you just sort of peer over from Layman Street and you can see it. So the next one, obviously a warehouse, because the amount of stuff that was coming into the port, there were a number of warehouses, and this one is in Telford Street, built 1888, and Souters says it combines a functional structure system with the elegance of classical and original detailing. That has been refurbished, and it's a combination of business and residential use. Now, you have to mention Walter Liberty Vernon. He was the government architect, and he was responsible for a number of the major buildings in Newcastle. And they included the post office, the courthouse, Boatman's Row, and the former Newcastle East School. Now, if you're familiar with some of these buildings in Sydney, like the Land Titles Office, Department of Lands, beautiful sandstone building, the Supreme Court building, the Customs House. So, I mean, the standard of his work is just amazing. So we're very lucky to have a number of those buildings. So this is the Boatman's Row, which he designed, and that was basically for people who worked as rescuers if there were shipping disasters, so they had to be close to the ocean. And so today they are used as residential properties. And the courthouse, mentioned that before. So its strong symmetricality and dominant central bay, establishing a presence beyond its size, and used for over 100 years. Now, fortunately with that, a Japanese University of Nihon has purchased that building, renovated it, and it looks great at the moment. So we're fortunate that still stands. Now, this is just me going off. I sat at this, the number of times I've sat at this intersection waiting for the lights to change, thinking, what in the hell is that building? Because it's got 1887 on it. So if you know where I'm talking about,
Yes.
King, Steel Streets, it was the office for the former gas company. So the gas company was behind that very big complex. Now, you might also remember the parking station for Hunter Water employees. You remember that on King Street? That was part of the retort house for the gas company. That has recently been demolished. And now it's a big hole in the ground waiting for a residential tower. But next time you go past it, gas company. So, all right. And of course, I have to finish with what I interpret as being the most significant building in Newcastle. Now, this is when it opened in 1903. And to see it today, I think it says something about our community if it gets demolished. It is just so sad to see. And just look at it, it's magnificent. So, you know, that's the crown as far as I'm concerned as regards significant buildings in Newcastle. And that's just a number of the resources I've used. If you're interested in early Newcastle architect, the Reedman one is, you know, extremely well done, very thick book. And there's also Architecture Newcastle and Mencken's Centenary Exhibition. So is there anyone who could add us to that list as regards the significant buildings that you think I should have included?
Perhaps Argyle House, or a lot of people here would remember it as Fanny's probably.
Fanny's,
Yeah,
yes.
they're all gone there.
Yeah. So Argyle House is basically the headquarters for the AA company when they operated. So we're talking Argyle Street and Wharf Road. And yeah, basically last I checked on that, last year there was a DA in to convert it to a residence. So you go
A residence.
a residence, a very substantial residence with a swimming pool, yes. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. It's in a sad state at the moment, but yes. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. So,
Very much.
you know, they've got some fascinating architecture and some of it's in good state and others absolutely depressing. All right.
Great. Oh, that's absolutely fabulous. Oh, wonderful to see everything set out like that. I can see myself now taking a drive round
Yes.
Newcastle with slightly different outlook on things. Yes. Certainly some wonderful architecture. And a great shame some of it was there. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you again for your wonderful presentation.